Mom sided with stepdad and his kids, kicked me out, but they forgot that I own a house. Now it's time to take it back. It never occurred to me, 35M, that my father's meticulous estate planning would ultimately cause our family to fall apart. There's a lot to digest here, and I want to make sure I'm giving you the whole picture. So let me start at the beginning. One of the big tech businesses in Seattle employs me as a senior software architect. My dad always had this kind of job in mind for me. Technology is the future, he would exclaim proudly after I was accepted to UW's computer science program. He had a profitable construction business and wasn't a techie, but he had a remarkable knack for predicting trends. Beginning with the recession of the late 1980s, Dad started his construction business from the ground up. Throughout some of the most difficult periods in the industry, he took on projects that other contractors wouldn't take on, using only a pickup truck and his tools. Back then, Mom told me they lived in a small apartment and were frugal, but Dad had this unwavering faith in his vision. He would frequently remark, "The key is to build relationships, not just buildings." That way of thinking got him through his difficult early years. Dad's business was unique because of the way he treated both customers and staff. Even if it meant losing some bids or rivals who made exaggerated deadline promises, he was a firm believer in open pricing and truthful schedules. First establish trust, he would advise. He was correct when he said, "The profits will follow." His business, which was renowned for taking on intricate restoration projects requiring both technical expertise and historical sensitivity, rose to prominence in the Seattle area by the mid-1990s because of the devotion he developed with his clients and staff. Dad's business survived the 2008 financial crisis when many construction companies were failing. He didn't fire a single employee during that period. Rather, he reduced his personal income to zero and took out a second mortgage on his cherished Mustang. I learned more about leadership from watching him handle that issue than I could have from any management course. "Your employees are your extended family," he told me. "You take care of them, they'll take care of your business." I didn't realize at the time how much his managerial approach affected my own career. Many of his ideas were put to use when I was promoted to team lead at my software business. I established thorough documentation procedures for our code, much as he had kept thorough project logs for every building site. I was able to lead my development team through challenging project deadlines thanks to his focus on fostering good relationships. I met Emily, 34F, at a hackathon in my junior year. She assisted in planning the event while pursuing her studies in business administration. Despite my lack of sleep, energy drink addiction, and likely messy appearance, she somehow found my love of code charming. From the first time he laid eyes on her, Dad fell in love. He told me, "She grounds you." Following their first meal together, "Don't let this one get away." After college, Dad even assisted Emily in launching her own marketing firm. He introduced her to his network of local company owners, showed her how he drafted his contracts, and shared his business objectives with her. He would tell us, "Success isn't just about what you know, it's about helping others succeed too." Dad was always imparting his expertise, always educating. Those formative years were unique. Emily and I would always make the drive to my parents' house on Sundays to have dinner. We would all sit on the back deck that Dad had constructed and chat about everything and nothing while he lit the grill. Even though he couldn't understand the majority of the technical details of my most recent work, he would still ask in-depth inquiries. Mom used to say, "There they go again with computer talk." With a loving eye roll, Dad's pride and joy was the house itself. He purchased it with the proceeds from his first significant construction job in the 1990s, a historic restoration project that made his business famous in one of Seattle's older neighborhoods. This lovely craftsman-style home features a wraparound porch and a garage that he transformed into the most well-organized workshop you've ever seen. Labeled and placed with almost fanatical precision, each tool had its place. Dad handled the house as though it were a living example of his skill. Every renovation was meticulously organized and recorded. Every repair, improvement, and paint job was documented in a thorough spreadsheet that he maintained. "A house is like a living thing," he would say as he demonstrated for me how to clean the gutters or inspect the foundation. He maintained a strict maintenance regimen, checking the roof after winter storms, changing air filters, and ensuring no small issues turned into big problems. In addition to being his haven, the workshop served as a classroom where he taught me about more than just tools. He had completely renovated the garage himself, adding unique storage options and a workbench designed specifically for teaching me woodworking. Every piece of wood has its own story, he would say as we worked. The pegboard wall, with delineated shapes for each tool, wasn't just about organization. It was his method of teaching me that everything has a place and a purpose. Our job is to help tell that story. Our family held weekends in high regard. In that garage, Dad and I would work on his 1967 Mustang for hours on end. When I was 12, he purchased it for restoration, claiming it would be a project to strengthen our bond as father and son. That vehicle became a classroom for life lessons. His advice, which I still abide by today, was straightforward. Always use the right tool for the job. And shortcuts look tempting, but they'll cost you in the long run. Although Dad could have completed the Mustang restoration in a year, it took 3. He was more interested in the process than the final destination. I learned everything from project management to fundamental mechanics from him. We took pictures of every component we changed, recorded each step, and maintained thorough logs of our progress. "This isn't just about fixing a car," he would affirm. "It's about learning how to break down big problems into manageable pieces." That lesson proved invaluable in my profession as a software developer. After Emily and I got married, we purchased a small home about 20 minutes from my parents' house. Although Dad insisted that we take out the mortgage in our names, he helped us with the down payment. "You need to build your own credit history," he clarified. "It's about standing on your own feet." He taught me how to install ceiling fans and fix drywall as he worked on our renovations on the weekends. He was preparing me for the responsibilities of homeownership even back then. At this time, my career was really taking off. I had just received a promotion to team lead, overseeing a team that was creating infrastructure solutions. I enjoyed every second of it, even if the hours were long and the strain was great. During my lunch breaks, Dad would frequently call to check in, without discussing anything specific. He was aware of the demands of managing a group and overseeing the work of others. "Remember to delegate," he would say. "You can't do everything yourself, just like I can't build a house alone." When Dad initially started feeling exhausted all the time, we were discussing the possibility of starting a family. He continued to put off seeing a doctor, despite Mom's insistence. Just working too hard. He would dismiss our worries. At the time, he was working on his largest project to date, a multi-million-dollar development deal that would have established his business for the next 10 years. In retrospect, I regret not pressing harder and insisting on those examinations sooner. Perhaps things might have turned out differently. The business was expanding quickly. Dad was discussing growing into historical restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest and had recently launched a second office in Portland. He had established a reputation for updating the infrastructure of historic structures without sacrificing their character. He would tell his clients, it's about embracing the future while respecting the past. Everything he accomplished, both personally and professionally, was influenced by his love of preservation. The Mustang was the subject of our last meaningful discussion. He was talking about taking it to car shows now that we had completed the restoration. We should sign up for the Pacific Northwest Classic, he said, his eyes glowing like a child. He continued to plan for the future until the very end. Show these youngsters what a real muscle car looks like. Then, everything changed. That morning began like any other until Mom called. My phone buzzed while I was in an early meeting. We were in the midst of an important project conversation, so I nearly didn't answer. But something told me I had to. When I stepped out to take the call, Mom was crying so hard she could barely speak. Dad had collapsed at a construction site. By the time I arrived at the hospital, he was already gone. The doctor said it was a sudden and severe heart attack. He was only 58. The weeks following Dad's passing were a haze of mourning and bureaucracy. The funeral was crowded. Dad's business and community involvement had touched countless lives. Suppliers, contractors, and even rival businesses came to show their support. Everybody shared a story about how Dad had supported them, given them advice, or simply been there when they needed someone to confide in. One old craftsman told me how, despite being unable to work during prolonged illness, Dad had managed to keep him on the payroll. Your father understood that business was about people first, he said. The workers at the company were heartbroken. Many of them had known Dad for decades, and they told me things I'd never heard before, like how he paid for the college textbooks of one foreman's daughter, assisted another through a divorce, or stayed late to teach apprentices the nuances of historical restoration. With pictures and handwritten remarks from both clients and employees, the workplace conference room was transformed into an unofficial monument to his legacy. We were all surprised by how well Dad had prepared for everything. His attorney, Mr. Anderson, summoned us for a meeting a week after the funeral. He took out an enormous accordion file with family security protocol neatly handwritten by Dad on the cover. Inside were dozens of carefully arranged documents, each with comprehensive instructions covering various aspects of the estate. Mr. Anderson gave me a 3-day tour of Dad's paperwork. Each color-coded container had personal notes explaining his decisions, in addition to the legal paperwork. I've never seen an estate plan this thorough in my 35 years of practice, Mr. Anderson remarked. Dad had even included a 5-year business transition plan with backup strategies for different circumstances. After that, Mom began attending her church's bereavement support group. That's where she first met Steve, 58M. At first, she only mentioned him in passing. Steve suggested this great book about healing. Or, Steve said it's normal to feel this way. He was one of the group facilitators and had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. Even though it seemed a little soon, I was happy that she was receiving support. Emily reminded me that everyone experiences grief in their own way. Every Tuesday night, the church grief support group met. Before long, Mom was attending church functions with Steve more often. After services, coffee gatherings turned into lunch meetings, which eventually became dinner dates. Our family friends began to worry about how quickly their friendship was developing. At a family gathering, my Aunt Jane pulled me aside, concerned that Mom was rushing into things to fill the void Dad had left. Mom's changes became more apparent. She cut her hair, started dressing differently, and even got rid of the garden that Dad had helped her create. Whenever I asked about these changes, she would simply say, it's time for a fresh start. The woman who used to spend hours reminiscing about her life with Dad now barely mentioned him. Things moved faster than any of us expected. 6 months after Dad's death, Mom announced that Steve was moving in. His grown children, James, 30M, and Lisa, 32F, believed it would be good to bring new life into the house. I made an effort to be sympathetic, but it seemed like she was in a rush to replace everything Dad had constructed. I'm at a crossroads right now. How can I preserve Dad's legacy without jeopardizing Mom's chances for happiness? Emily advises me to strike a balance, but I can't help but think of Dad's letter. Son, preserve those memories first. Update. I apologize for the wait and appreciate all the advice you gave on my previous article. 3 months have passed since my last post, and things have become much worse. Steve's domineering demeanor used to bother me, but now he acts as though he owns a house my dad left me. Last month, Steve decided to start a major restoration project, without even asking my permission. When I visited one weekend, contractors were tearing up the built-in bookshelves Dad had made for the living room. As if he owned the place, Steve was watching over them, directing them to just throw all this old wood in the dumpster. Those shelves were the last project Dad and I worked on together before he became ill. They were more than just shelves. When I approached Steve, he responded angrily. Look, son, he said, emphasizing the word condescendingly. This house needs to be brought into the 21st century. Your father's taste was, well, dated. We're doing you a favor by increasing the property value. I reminded him that, legally, any modifications require my consent. Mom obviously agreed with him, but Steve just chuckled. Your mother and I live here. We don't need permission to improve our home. Steve knows about these things, she said. He's just trying to help. The woman who once loved those bookshelves, the one who used to proudly display her collection of antique teacups on them for Christmas, now acted as though they were just taking up space. I showed her Dad's detailed house maintenance plans, but she dismissed them as dwelling in the past. The situation gets worse. The relationship with Steve's children has also deteriorated. James took over Dad's workshop and turned it into a CrossFit facility. While I was on a business trip, he held a garage sale and sold most of Dad's tools. Meanwhile, Lisa has treated the house like her personal design project, repainting rooms and replacing Dad's meticulously refinished hardwood floors with modern vinyl planks. One evening after dinner, Steve pulled me aside. Since we're paying to live here, we should have our names on the deed. It's only fair, he said. I had to explain to him that they don't pay a mortgage. Dad's planning had paid for the house in full. They don't even cover rent. All maintenance expenses, insurance, and property taxes are covered by me. Emily suggested that we stop making weekly visits now that Emma is here. She's right. No one benefits from the stress in that household. But stepping back has only made Steve more confident. He started sending me bills for improvements I never approved. Worse, he's been making them more frequently. I should be more sympathetic to Mom's new life. At least, according to Mom's sister, who called me recently. I attempted to explain Dad's intentions and my legal obligations, but she simply accused me of being trapped in the past. Steve makes her happy. Why can't you just let them make the house their own? She asked. This week, I found out that the growth markers recording my height from ages 3 to 18 had been removed from the kitchen door frame. Every birthday, Dad would measure me and write the date next to each mark. When I confronted Mom about it, she shrugged it off. It's just an old door frame. We can't keep every piece of it just because your father touched it, she remarked. Now, I spend more time sitting in Dad's old chair, the only piece of furniture I was able to keep, in my own garage. Mr. Anderson advises me to start considering long-term solutions. Legally, the house belongs to me, but at some point, I will have to make difficult choices about its future. When does being the bad guy become more important than preserving your father's legacy? And when your whole family opposes you, how do you defend the moral high ground? Update 2. I appreciate all your advice regarding my previous post. The situation has now reached a breaking point, and I finally made a choice, one that will most likely change everything. Last week, I spoke with my financial advisor about the house situation. Property values in the area have risen by 40% in the last 3 years. If rented out, the house could generate enough income to fully cover Emma's future college fund. During that discussion, I realized something. I've been so caught up in the sentimental aspects that I never considered the financial consequences of allowing Mom and Steve to live there rent-free. Everything went haywire when I brought this up to Mom during our weekly conversation. She yelled into the phone, "You can't do this to us. This is where we call home. Steve has worked really hard on it." She refused to listen as I tried to explain that I was only considering my options. Instead, she kept talking about all the improvements they had made, completely ignoring the fact that I never approved any of those changes. An hour later, Steve called. His tone was different, less arrogant, more agitated. "Listen here," he announced. "We built a life in this house. Just because you're missing your father doesn't mean you can walk in and ruin everything." When I attempted to explain the financial situation, he cut me off. "We have sweat equity in this property now," he argued. I reminded him that the house legally belongs to me. There's a reason why Dad left it to me. Steve's response chilled me. "Your father isn't here anymore. You need to think about the living." I talked to Emily. I talked to Mr. Anderson. I thought about it before deciding on it. The following day, when I arrived at the house, Mom and Steve were working on yet another remodeling job in the dining room. They had begun ripping out the original crown molding, which Dad had specifically milled to blend in with the house's antique style. That image made me more determined. They have 2 weeks to find another place to live, I told them. Mom burst into tears at once, accusing me of being callous and harsh. Steve tried to scare me by arguing about my inability to throw them out on the street. He began enumerating all of their local ties, including his place of employment, their church, and their neighborhood pals. When faced with challenging circumstances, I maintained my composure and firmness, just as my father had taught me. I declared, "This is my property. Dad left it to me for a reason, and I'm exercising my legal right as the owner." Steve's cheeks flushed, and he began listing all the money they had spent on upgrades. I informed him that the historical value of the property had actually been diminished by these unapproved alterations. When Lisa returned home and joined the debate, things became worse. Mom immediately utilized her pregnancy as emotional leverage. "How are you able to treat your stepsister this way? She will give birth to a child." Although Lisa's pregnancy was significant to them, I had to make it clear that it did not affect my property rights, and that she was not my stepsister. There's been an ongoing assault of emotional manipulation ever since. Mom's whole family has banded together to oppose me. Her sister called, sobbing, saying their parents want to make sure Mom was safe. Messages regarding the challenging rental market were left by Steve's brother, a local real estate agent. Long messages on Christian ideals and family loyalty are even coming from distant cousins I hardly know. Dealing with family friends who have known me since my early years is the most difficult. People who grew up with me now tell me how unhappy they are with my decisions, and every call feels like another tiny betrayal. Some even claim that I'm damaging Dad's standing in the neighborhood. The problem is that this has nothing to do with cruelty or profit. This is about honoring Dad's desires and preserving the things he created. It has been agonizing enough to see them methodically destroy all traces of him. The house was his legacy. I paid for all their expenses, allowed them to live rent-free for years, and put up with their unapproved changes. Eventually, enough is enough. They have 2 weeks to come up with new plans. I'm refusing to give in to Mom's constant demands for more time. Mr. Anderson claims that the law is entirely on my side and that I have been more than generous. He is assisting me in creating official paperwork for the notice to vacate, ensuring that everything is accurately documented. I realize that this makes me appear to be the villain in everyone else's tale, but sometimes standing up for what's right requires making difficult choices, even when others disagree. I learned that from my dad. Third update. We appreciate everyone's help during this trying time. Things have come to an unavoidable end, so this will likely be my last update. I assigned Mom and Steve a 2-week deadline, but it's already passed. The past 2 weeks have been the longest of my life. They have been filled with guilt-tripping, constant emotional manipulation, and progressively frantic attempts to get me to change my mind. Mom did everything she could. Every day she called, oscillating between fury and tears. One day, she would say, "I changed your diapers. I gave up everything for you." The next day, she would yell. Steve also changed strategies. Instead of using intimidation, he tried to negotiate. He suggested establishing a formal lease and offered to begin paying rent. But given what they had done to Dad's house, I couldn't trust him to uphold any agreements we made. When I arrived at the house, I found people gathering on the front lawn. 3 days before the deadline, Mom had enlisted the help of friends from church, family, and even some of Dad's former business partners. They had prepared statements about moral commitments and family responsibilities as part of what amounted to an intervention. For 2 hours, I listened to people criticize me for being a bad son. Mom's pastor spoke about honoring your parents. Dad's old secretary remembered his generosity with tears in her eyes. My elementary school teacher even came to remind me of the morals my father had tried to teach me. The hardest part was when Lisa got up and talked about how stress could hurt her unborn child, covering her pregnant abdomen with her hands while Mom sobbed next to her. A few of the church women glared at me. It was an expert lesson in emotional manipulation. Emotions. But during this ambush, an unexpected event occurred. I had a strange sense of serenity. As I sat there, listening to everyone talk about Dad, I noticed people who hadn't even been to his funeral suddenly professing to know what he would have wanted. Dad used to say, "Stand your ground when you know you're right," and I could almost hear his voice in my thoughts. I got to my feet and spoke to the group. I described how Dad planned everything carefully to ensure his family's future, and how he had constructed this house by hand. I showed them pictures of Steve's unapproved modifications, including the historical elements he ruined and the fine craftsmanship he removed and replaced with flimsy modern fixtures. After that, I presented them with a letter from Dad outlining his reasons for leaving everything to me. Some of the elder business associates nodded as I read his remarks about trust, accountability, and preserving his legacy. They understood because they had truly known Dad. Shortly thereafter, the group scattered. While some looked disapproving, the righteous wrath had subsided. Others gently apologized as they walked away without saying another word. Mom and Steve returned inside. I stood there with Mr. Anderson and a locksmith on the morning of a deadline. Although they weren't required, I had hired a security company to be on hand, just in case. The house was deserted. The remainder of their possessions were packed into Steve's truck. Steve couldn't help but give me a last poke, but Mom refused to look at me. As he assisted into his pickup, he asked, "You're happy with yourself? Your father would be so proud of how you've treated your mother." I didn't answer. Dad would have known. I knew he had prepared for this possibility. What other reason might he have had for being so explicit in his will? After they had left, I strolled through the home. I had underestimated the extent of the harm. Builder-grade materials had been used to replace the original fittings. Dad's handcrafted woodwork had been painted over or taken out completely. We had spent so many weekends in the workshop, and it had changed beyond recognition. I have no intention of pursuing damages, but Mr. Anderson documented everything for any legal considerations. I simply want to put this chapter behind me and concentrate on fixing what can be fixed. Some of Dad's old craftsman friends have already been contacted, and they're eager to assist in rebuilding the features that were taken out. For now, Mom is staying with her sister. The majority of my relatives have stopped talking to me altogether. However, some occasionally call to chastise me on social media. Steve's children continue to share heartbreaking updates about their poor mother being thrown out of her home, but fewer people are responding to each post. Through it all, Emily has been my pillar of support. She reminds me of Dad's letter whenever I begin to doubt myself, expressing his faith in my ability to make the right choices. I will eventually tell Emma about her grandfather and the heritage he attempted to preserve, but she is too little to comprehend what is occurring right now. To restore the house to its original state, I'm collaborating with a restoration professional. We can preserve the spirit of what Dad made, but it won't be perfect. Some things can't be reversed. First, the workshop will be restored. The same place where I learned from my father is where I want my daughter to study. Being the villain in someone else's tale is sometimes the price of doing the right thing. I may never be able to rebuild the relationships I lost, but I can live with the fact that I preserved what my father trusted me with. As Dad used to say, integrity is about doing the right thing even when it hurts, not about taking the easy route. I believe he would understand. My last update will be this one. I appreciate everyone's support along this journey. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.